He thought he was humiliating just another defendant when he lashed out with his boot in the middle of a packed courtroom. But Officer Darren Pike had no idea he was about to kick an undercover federal agent. And in the next 3 seconds, his entire career would begin to collapse. The air inside Courtroom 7C in Redwood Falls was thick with the sour blend of old paper, floor polish, and tension, the kind of humidity that clings to the skin and makes tempers rise just a little faster. And at the defense table sat Marcus Hale, hands folded loosely in front of him, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady on the state seal mounted behind the judge's bench, looking for all the world like a tired blue-collar worker who had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. He wore scuffed boots, dark jeans, and a plain charcoal shirt stretched across a broad chest, and though his posture was calm, there was something deliberate in the way he held himself. Balanced, centered, alert, something most people in that room were too distracted or too dismissive to notice. Judge Evelyn Harper flipped through the docket with visible impatience, her glasses sliding down her nose as she sighed at the growing stack of minor offenses scheduled before lunch, and when the clerk called the case, State versus Marcus Hale, charges of resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, and obstruction, an audible murmur rippled through the gallery, because everyone in Redwood Falls knew who had made the arrest. Officer Darren Pike, a 10-year veteran of the Redwood Falls Police Department, with a reputation for being tough on crime, a phrase that in certain neighborhoods translated into traffic stops that escalated without reason and reports that always seemed to justify whatever force he decided to use. Pike stood near the prosecution table with his thumbs hooked in his duty belt, jaw tight, chewing gum with slow contempt, his uniform pressed and his boots polished to a mirror shine, projecting authority like it was armor. And when Judge Harper asked Marcus if he had legal representation, Marcus's voice carried low and even through the room as he said, "No, Your Honor. I'll represent myself," which earned a short laugh from Pike that wasn't loud enough to be contempt but was clear enough to sting. Pike took the stand and launched into his account with rehearsed confidence, claiming he had pulled Marcus over for a broken taillight on Route 18, that he had detected suspicious behavior, that Marcus had refused lawful commands, and that he had feared for his safety. Words that sounded official, almost sterile, as they floated into the record. But when Marcus rose to respond, he did not pace or gesture wildly. He simply stated that he had asked for a warrant before consenting to a vehicle search, that he had kept his hands visible, that he had not resisted in any physical way, and that there should be dash cam footage to confirm his version of events. Pike cut him off with a scoff, muttering something about equipment malfunction, and though the judge gave him a mild warning about interrupting, there was no real rebuke, no visible concern about the missing footage and that imbalance. The subtle tilting of the room in favor of the batch hung heavy in the air as Pike stepped down from the witness stand and began walking back toward his seat. The aisle between the stand and the defense table was wide enough for 2 people to pass comfortably, but Pike drifted closer to Marcus as he moved, his shoulder nearly brushing him, and for a brief moment the 2 men stood inches apart, Pike radiating irritation at Marcus's composure, at the lack of fear in his eyes, at the quiet refusal to bow. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't break eye contact with the seal on the wall, and that stillness seemed to ignite something ugly inside Pike, something that needed submission, something that demanded reaction. "Watch where you're standing," Pike muttered under his breath, and then, in a movement so quick it could almost be mistaken for clumsiness, he pivoted and drove his boot hard into the side of Marcus's knee. A sharp, calculated strike designed not just to hurt, but to destabilize, to send him crashing to the floor in front of the entire courtroom as a reminder of who held power there. The sound of leather slamming into muscle echoed off the wooden benches, a sick, dull thud that made a woman in the second row gasp, and Pike straightened immediately, preparing his face into an expression of mock surprise, as if to suggest Marcus had somehow stepped into him. But Marcus did not collapse. In the fraction of a second before impact, he had shifted his weight subtly, absorbing the force into the thick muscle of his thigh instead of the joint, and no pain flared hot along his leg. His balance never wavered. Pike's eyes flickered with confusion, then fury, because the humiliation he had intended had failed, and in that flash of wounded ego, he made his second mistake. He drew his foot back again, lifting it higher this time for a more aggressive strike. What happened next unfolded so fast that the courtroom barely processed it. Marcus's hand shot out, open-palmed, catching Pike's ankle midair with effortless precision, his other foot pivoting against the polished floor as he rotated his hips and applied a controlled sweep to Pike's planted leg. And suddenly the officer who had entered the room with swagger was horizontal, spinning awkwardly before slamming face first into the tile with a bone-rattling crash that sent his radio skittering. Across the floor, gasps erupted, chairs scraped back, the bailiff shouted, and Pike, red-faced and stunned, scrambled on his hands and knees toward his holster in a blind surge of panic. But Marcus stepped forward smoothly, pinning Pike's wrist against the floor with calculated pressure that froze the motion without snapping bone, his voice calm and unwavering as he said, "Do not reach for that weapon." Words that carried neither rage nor fear, only command. Deputies rushed in then, tackling Marcus from behind, forcing him down and wrenching his arms back into cuffs while Pike rolled away, clutching his wrist and shouting accusations of assault. And as Marcus's cheek pressed against the cool tile, he turned his head slightly toward the back of the courtroom, where a young journalist stood with her phone raised, her hands trembling but steady enough to capture every second. "Did you get it?" he mouthed silently, and when she gave the faintest nod, a subtle shift passed across Marcus Hale's expression, not satisfaction, not triumph, but confirmation, because Officer Darren Pike thought he had just dominated another defendant in his city. But what he had really done was expose himself in front of a witness, a camera, and a man who had walked into that courtroom with a badge of his own hidden beneath ordinary clothes. And as deputies hauled him to his feet, and Pike spat a slur through clenched teeth, promising that he would make sure Marcus never walked these streets again. Marcus met his glare with steady eyes and said quietly, so only Pike could hear, "You have no idea who you just kicked." He thought the handcuffs on Marcus Hale meant control, but by the time Officer Darren Pike finished rewriting his report, control had already slipped out of his hands. In the basement holding cell beneath the Redwood Falls courthouse, Marcus sat upright on the narrow steel bench, wrists marked red from the cuffs, but posture steady, breathing slow and deliberate. The deputies who had shoved him inside expected anger, maybe panic, but found neither. Upstairs, Pike was pacing in Captain Howard Mills' office, fury masking the flicker of doubt creeping into his thoughts. "Stack the charges," Pike insisted. "Felony assault on an officer. Make it airtight." Mills nodded distractedly, his attention pulled toward the muted television in the corner where shaky footage from Courtroom 7C was already spreading across local news. The video was clear, clearer than Pike had anticipated. It showed the kick. It showed the second attempt. It showed his hand reaching toward his firearm before Marcus restrained him. Social media commentators were slowing it down, analyzing angles, questioning why an officer initiated force inside a courtroom. Meanwhile, at the district attorney's office, a clerk attempted to pull Marcus Hale's background to prepare the enhanced charges. Instead of a criminal history, a gray notification box appeared, federal restriction. Clearance required. She refreshed the system. Same result. IT was called. Same result. "We don't have access to this file," the technician said carefully. "Whatever it is, it's above us." At 4:12 p.m., the front desk phone rang at the precinct. Officer Ramirez answered, expecting another angry citizen. Instead, a calm, authoritative voice introduced itself. "Assistant Director Naomi Carter, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I need your commanding officer." Within minutes, Captain Mills was gripping the phone as Carter delivered the sentence that changed everything. "You are currently detaining Special Agent Marcus Hale." Mills went pale. Pike overheard enough to scoff. "That's a bluff." But it stopped sounding like one when 3 unmarked black SUVs rolled into the courthouse lot, and a team of suited federal agents entered with quiet precision. They didn't rush. They didn't argue. Credentials were displayed. Access was requested and granted. In the basement cell, Marcus rose smoothly as Carter approached. "Agent Hale," she said. "Ma'am," he replied. She handed him a slim folder outlining Operation Iron Veil, an ongoing federal investigation into patterns of civil rights violations within the Redwood Falls Police Department. Financial irregularities linked to Pike. Inflated resisting arrest charges. Archive complaints buried without review. Marcus's traffic stop had not been scheduled, but Pike's public escalation had accelerated everything. You injured? Carter asked. Nothing significant, Marcus answered evenly. Upstairs, 2 agents approached Pike. Officer Darren Pike, one began. Sergeant, Pike corrected automatically. The agent continued without pause. You are being detained pending investigation into civil rights violations, falsification of reports, and obstruction. The room fell silent. He attacked me, Pike protested. But even as he spoke, he saw Marcus emerge from the stairwell beside federal officials. Not as a defendant, but as one of them. Pike's jaw tightened. You set me up. Marcus met his stare calmly. No, he said. You made a choice. Outside, cameras were already gathering as Pike was led through the lobby in cuffs, and what he had intended as a display of dominance had instead exposed a pattern of misconduct to the entire country. The kick that was supposed to break a man's knee had cracked open an investigation months in the making, and Redwood Falls was no longer in charge of what happened next. By the end of the week, Redwood Falls was no longer talking about a courtroom scuffle. It was facing a federal reckoning. The viral video had spread nationwide, replayed again and again. The kick, the failed second strike, the reach for the weapon. Frame by frame, it dismantled Officer Darren Pike's version of events. What he had called self-defense looked, under scrutiny, like aggression. What he had assumed would be buried in paperwork had instead been illuminated under a national spotlight. Inside the courthouse, the tone was no longer local or casual. The original charges against Marcus Hale were dismissed outright. In their place came federal filings, civil rights violations, falsification of reports, obstruction. Operation Iron Veil, once quiet and confidential, was now part of the public record. Financial ties to towing contractors, patterns of inflated resisting arrest charges, citizen complaints that had been ignored were quietly archived. The case against Pike was no longer about one moment of anger. It was about years of conduct. Pike sat stiffly at the defense table, the swagger gone. Across the room, Marcus remained composed, answering questions with the same measured tone he had used from the beginning. He did not exaggerate. He did not gloat. He simply described what happened. When the courtroom footage was played again, there were no objections that carried weight. The evidence was clear. The federal judge's remarks were brief but pointed. Authority is a responsibility, not a weapon. Abuse of that authority carries consequences. Proceedings would continue, but the direction was unmistakable. Outside, cameras captured Pike being escorted through a side exit. Marcus left through the front. Reporters called out questions, but he paused only long enough to say, accountability isn't personal. It's necessary. Within days, the Redwood Falls Police Department entered federal oversight. Internal reviews widened. Other officers were questioned. The culture that had shielded misconduct began to crack. Marcus Hale didn't stay to watch it unfold. 2 days later, he was reassigned. Another city, another investigation. No ceremony. No headlines announcing his departure. Just a quiet transfer logged in a secure system. Officer Darren Pike had kicked a man he thought was powerless. Instead, he had collided with discipline, documentation, and a truth already in motion. And when the dust settled, one reality remained. Power built on intimidation collapses quickly when exposed to the light.